other than that, well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to the organizers, especially Dr. Jill Muller, for contacting me and bringing me back to this conference after collaborating with her in a previous event. Um, uh, this talk is about the idea of this paradox that menstruating bodies find themselves at, and hopefully throughout the presentation, I'll take you on this journey, on this journey that philosophy has been so likely to be able to discover. But just first of all, I think it's important to underline the way that philosophers or any professionals within the humanities like we have seen today are often described as being between worlds, with the ability to transcend borders and analyze specific elements through different lenses across areas, identifying concepts that fall through the cracks, that are trapped between the limits of what scientific inquiry has deemed worthy of being researched. This categorization has been significantly influenced by the observer, by who has taken that study on, and philosophy can help us really understand whether specific occurrences have been cast out from a scientific literature. The absence of menstruating bodies in clinical studies has indeed been highlighted as a sign of gender bias, and despite the extensive literature supporting the distinct nature of menstruating bodies in comparison to normative male bodies, clinical research has decided to concentrate solely on how clinical phenomena affected male bodies, extrapolating to menstruating bodies, finding from studies that had systematically excluded them from the sample groups. So basically, the idea is that the menstruating bodies are special, but that being special hasn't always been in our favor. This presentation highlights the limitations of menstruating bodies representation in medical research, highlighting the minimal presence menstruating bodies have been granted in clinical studies and the dangerous biases that have become ingrained in menstruating narratives, putting menstruating bodies' health in clear jeopardy. There are different reasons science is currently in this situation, and I have gathered a few that other scholars have put forward, such as the fact that diagnosis development for improving women's reproductive health has been hampered by lack of understanding basic uterine and menstrual physiology. At the same time, the increase in specialization of medicine in recent decades has fragmented the body and has isolated some functions like the reproductive function without recognizing how different systems collaborate and work with each other. There's also a persistent belief that the function of sex is reproduction, and if it doesn't have to do with pregnancy, if it doesn't have to do with reproduction itself, there is nothing else that we need to research about female physiology or menstruating physiologies. This reductionism, of course, has led health institutions to understand some issues as exclusively women's. And I think that's part of what Carlota was speaking about in the previous presentation. That is just a menstruating pathology. So what's the problem with that? And of course, scientific research, taking all this into account, has deemed non-normative bodies to be simply too complex to be accounted for, and that complexity has often been referred to as some kind of unpredictability. There is, as you can see there, books that have been able to challenge this narrative, but there is a lot of work to do still when it comes to moving forward within science. This almost implicit effort for scientific inquiry to leave menstruating bodies behind has limited the scientific production that has been done on menstrual cycles, and that has led to further misconception about what they are, how to manage them, etc. Science conducted on menstruating bodies has been criticized for drawing erroneous analogies between menstruating organisms and organisms that experience an oestrus. This is due to scientific knowledge on menstrual cycles being based almost in its entirety on studies on animals, such as apes or rabbits that do not experience a menstrual flow at all. The obsession of scientific research to highlight the homology between the menstrual cycle and the estrus cycle of other mammals has contributed to the absence of menstruated reference. So not only we done but when actually we are in scientific research, that research will rather happen in animals that have nothing to do really with us. Applying the concept of absent reference from feminist scholar Carol J. Adams, Tewksbury defined 3 phases through which menstruating bodies could have become absent reference. Philosophers have denounced the medicalization suffered by female bodies, and I think within that medicalization we can also see that process of becoming absent. On the one hand, we are objectified, and several philosophers have underlined this objectification through social control over the menstruating bodies. We are fragmented, again, that idea of a specialization where ovaries are something completely isolated, the reproductive system is something completely on the side, and further into this process of creating this absent reference consumption, we are reduced to disembodied elements that can be commercialized and again medicalized. Philosophers like Lippmann have actively described this process of disease creation in current health spheres and warns about the framing of natural experiences as causes of future diseases. Viewing menstrual cycles as a phenomena with a model of normality to follow has prompted a medicalization of menstruating bodies in pursuance of some kind of normal that is unfairly supported by scientific practice in many ways. So when we ask ourselves where our menstruators are in this really complex situation, in which on the one hand side we are not there, but on the other side, we are over medicalized, we are overly seen, we are constantly being told what to do with our bodies. We are indeed in that idea of a paradox. Feminist analysis of scientific practice has gathered the input of biologists, doctors, social scientists, etc., on research flaws present in science until then unaddressed. The main criticism underlined the particularly limited participation of female researchers in scientific practice resulted in a marginalization or even invisibilization of the research interest of this group. Feminist criticisms regarding scientific production also highlight the biased nature of what had been taken as the universal observer and pointed out the recurrent tendency of considering male features as the norm for all organisms. Women's bodies have been systematically excluded from the scope of clinical research, and that has been done during research phases. Again, women have been kept from taking part in clinical trials, but also during medical appointment. There is a clear invisibility when it comes to women going to doctors, women going to a clinician's office, and not being able to express what's happening with their body. This lack of quality information on women's health has prompted a process of over-medicalization, the one that we were just speaking about, where natural experiences are linked to problems that are interpreted as biological diseases that require medical surveillance or intervention. A clear example of the over-medicalization of women's reproductive health and its severe consequences is hormone replacement therapy, widely prescribed in the 50s, and treatment that prevented diseases that menopause was alleged to cause, and in contrast were shown to worsen them in a 2002 study. Processes like the start of menses, menstruation, menopause, and the dysmenorrhea concept that Carlota was just speaking about have often been viewed as a pathology that needs to be fixed or even suppressed. That is taking us through down a very, very dangerous path. So what's the current stage of menstrual research? And there's actually not a lot of information when it comes to, again, menstruating subjects, but one of the fields that has really tried to further the knowledge and awareness on menstruating bodies is that of physiology. The field of sports physiology has actually been one of the first to address the consequences of biased scientific research, underlining how confounding results will threaten the health, performance, and overall well-being of non-male athletes. These reviews also inquired how likely it was for papers to openly report on the unevenness of the participants. The findings showed that while 63% of the research conducted with a female-only participant group clearly stated the gender nature of their analysis, only 14% of the publications of their analysis in their title expressed that they were completed with a male-exclusive group. This lack of transparency, of course, is particularly concerning if taken into account that traditionally endorsed tendency of scientific research is to extrapolate findings obtained from research made exclusively of male subjects to everyone else. As reported, only 1 in every 10 papers conducted on male subjects will clearly state the limitations of their subject groups, leading, of course, to potential misinterpretations. The high percentage of publication that only accounted for male participants prompted the question whether this was due to said papers investigating male-specific topics, but surprisingly, only 0.6% of male-exclusive research concerned male-specific topics. In contrast, 20% of the publications, including female-only subjects, investigated female-specific factors such as menstrual cycle, hormonal contraceptive use, pregnancy, or breast cancer. This lack of understanding, this lack of information, this lack of presence of menstruating bodies in science philosophically has a really big impact, and it can lead to what we refer to through the concept of epistemic injustice, which invites philosophy to acknowledge the power in the act of determining what constitutes knowledge and what doesn't. Miranda Fricker, in this case, differentiated 2 different kinds of epistemic injustice, hermeneutical and hermeneutical injustice being the most relevant for the purpose of this talk. Hermeneutically marginalized subjects are not only prevented from participating in the activity of sense-making, but also kept from the generation of new meanings. So systemically exercised hermeneutical inequality can lead to the establishment of structurally prejudiced social groups. Ultimately, this can be referred to as a structural identity prejudice. And it can happen with any kind of knowledge, even knowledge on bodily functions that we think are completely accepted and widely acknowledged. Hermeneutical injustice involves an asymmetrical cognitive disadvantage, a situation where a subject or group is made unable to make sense or to communicate an experience, which, if intelligible and communicated, could be beneficial for them. For Fricker, the key to the incorporation of knowledge that has been excluded due to a gap in the hermeneutical resources available to the subject lays within the interlocutor, and they should have a special alertness or sensitivity to cases of hermeneutical dissonance. This interlocutor, referred to by Fricker as the virtuous hearer, will contribute to the generation of an inclusive hermeneutical environment, involving a more aware kind of listening. However virtuous, Fricker admitted the limitations of this interlocutor. Ultimately, the goal is to neutralize the impact of a structural identity prejudice that the subject may be facing. To this concept of epistemic injustice, I would like to connect the idea and developed by Jaga and Di Paolo. And the idea is that the threat of specific social groups to become ostracized could be addressed by the activity of sense making. That refers to how organisms may have an active role in the tailoring of this complex network and actively participate in the process of generating meaning. Organisms do not take part in this activity isolatedly. They take part through a process of mutual incorporation. This is defined as an expansion of the lived experience of each of the participants that corresponds to the reciprocal coordinations of the factors that enable the embodiment of the participant with their bodies, and as a result allow them to access activities of participatory sense-making. Mutual incorporations, very similar to the idea of the virtuous hearer, prompts the subjects to acknowledge divergences, and it may help for non-dominant and recurrently marginalized narratives, such as menstrual narratives, to be introduced into a more general knowledge, rather than what has happened until now, to encounter difficulties not only to enter but succeed at making an impact in mutual incorporation. So the idea of this talk and the conclusion of the overall talk is the idea that an understanding of the menstrual cycle should be promoted, not only from a perspective of self-knowledge and reflection, but from a social address that demands society and the health and educational institutions that they interact with, not to have a proactive approach towards menstruating bodies. Menstrual education in the schools should be offered from early ages that goes beyond reproduction and sex education. Self-awareness techniques for tracking each woman's cycles, learning how to identify events like ovulation through temperature, as well as any changes in the menstrual cycle should be taught, should be enabled. It should be something that we have access to. At the same time, there should be some thought as to what it means to have unbiased clinical education, and ensuring that current clinical practice guides are updated to reflect the differential nature of health and its dynamism within menstruating bodies. Lastly, we need more inclusive research protocols. Clinical research must undergo a review process of the registry processing and data dissemination, together with a thorough revision of their inclusion protocols. This hopefully will give place to some kind of standardized policies that should be encouraged, where menstrual terminologies are agreed and standardized, helping data collection and overall helping a vocabulary that we can all use to speak about what having a menstrual physiology looks like. And that's mainly the main intervention. Thank you so much.